Good evening and welcome. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. Beyond the Darkness is underway on this Thursday. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, Tim Dennis. Good evening, Tim.
Evening.
All right, I want to make a quick mention this evening, Timothy. Our show is being brought to you tonight by Casper. You can receive $50 towards any mattress purchased with CasperTrial.com/darkness. They are one of our sponsors for the evening. The other is True Car. So when you're in the market to buy a new or used car, visit True Car to enjoy a more confident car buying experience. All right, tomorrow night we're back. Ursula Bialski and Theater of the Mind. But Ursula is going to be talking to us about a brand new book she's working on, The Ghost in You, Poltergeists, Electrokinesis, and Phantasms of the Living. I'll also remind you I'm going to be hosting Coast to Coast AM this Saturday night from midnight till 4 a.m. You can find more information about the show, my guests, and more at coasttocoastam.com. And you can stream the show by going to our home station here, KNSIRadio.com. That's KNSIRadio.com. Go download it, pick it up. You get the free application. You can listen to the show from anywhere by using that. Tonight, Tim, we're always fascinated by the idea of time travel. Mm-hmm. And I've got to tell you, over 12 years of doing the show, we've talked to a few people that claim to have been involved in time travel or have time traveled.
Right.
And out of it, I mean, I know a lot of our listeners roll their eyes and they're like, come on, time travel? There's one guy, though, every time we throw him at our audience, he's the one guy that stands up. Nobody can really pick him apart.
Airtight story.
It's amazing because he's been, I think he's been doing the show for about 7 or 8 years with us, popping in periodically.
Right.
To talk to us about his experiences with Project Pegasus. Mm-hmm. And we had him on last year just before the elections talking, of course, because he was running for president as a presidential candidate.
Yep.
But he's back tonight to talk to us and update us kind of on the progress of his research and work into time travel. And Andrew Basiago is a prominent figure in the truth movement. For more than 10 years, he shared with the American people the true facts of our great nation's accomplishments in time travel and Mars visitation. He has done so as one who served bravely in 2 secret U.S. defense projects in which time travel on Earth and voyages to Mars were first undertaken. He's here with us tonight to talk to us about that. He'll also talk and introduce us to a few of his compatriots here that have got inside knowledge regarding the time travel programs and can shed some other light on what's going on. And it's going to be a fascinating ride, folks. So sit back, enjoy. And Andrew Basiago will be running for president of the United States with a new agenda for a new America. And he's vowed that if elected president, he will lead the American people into a bold new era of truth, reform, and innovation, as great as they are great. He's with us again tonight, Andy Basiago. Andy, thank you for coming back this evening, sir.
It's good to be back, Dave.
Great talking with you. For our audience, just to give a quick insight, Project Pegasus, the 2 secret programs you were a part of, from what year to what year did this take place?
Well, Project Pegasus was initially launched in the mid-1960s as a kind of an umbrella project under DARPA. I initially teleported from New Jersey to New Mexico with my late father, Raymond F. Basiago of the Ralph M. Parsons Company, in winter of 1968. So that really marks the time that teleportation was fully operational within the U.S. Defense Technical Community. We actually, from New Mexico, went directly into a meeting with Dr. Harold M. Agnew when he was the director of the Weapons Division at the Los Alamos National Labs. I was then officially placed in Project Pegasus in the fall of 1969 as an 8-year-old at the beginning of my 3rd grade year, because they were involving children for different project reasons. And I participated as one of the teleportees who basically broke the time travel barrier, in the sense that it was in 1970 that DARPA found a way to place the teleportee backward or forward in time by adjusting the teleporter. So that, for example, we would spend the better part of the day in New Mexico, but then when we would be sent back from Sandia back to Curtis Wright in New Jersey, it would be, let's say, 15 minutes after we had left that morning. Okay, so I actually participated in breaking the quantum barrier as one of the kids who was teleporting back and forth across the country in the late 60s and early 70s.
When you're doing this teleportation, I mean, most of us have that in vision of Star Trek, where your physical being, your atoms are being disconnected and then reassembled. Is there any truth to that aspect of what was going on, or how exactly does this science work of bringing you from one place to another?
Well, that's what you just described, that was featured on Star Trek around 1966-67, just as another form of teleportation was emerging secretly within the secret technical corridors of our government, is actually the opposite of what was achieved by Project Pegasus. In the Star Trek example, you disintegrate the teleportee at the point of embarkation, and then you reintegrate them at the destination. The problem with that approach, which is still the subject of whenever teleportation is discussed in the conventional science press, even to this day, is that process would kill a living organism. What Project Pegasus achieved by essentially completing the work of Tesla in this area is using a field of radiant energy to open up a vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space through which the teleportee passes. So you remain bodily intact, but they found a way basically to create a tunnel in the fabric of time. Time and space are incredibly dense. There are as many ergs of energy in a single meter of space as there are grains of sand on every beach on Earth. Okay, so we live in a very densely packed universe, and by 1968 or earlier, DARPA found a way of opening up a tunnel in time-space through which we were passing.
With doing this and opening up this future-altering possibility and sending children through, I mean, there seems like there would be some real inherent danger in that, Andy, sending a child in to do work that could unravel the fabric of the reality we know. How do they keep control of something like that?
Well, quite frankly, this is one of the reasons I've been speaking out now for over 10 years. I'm not sure they were in control of what was happening, in the sense that maybe some of these disappearance cases that researchers like David Paulides have focused on, so even some strange stories of sort of repositioning in time space that have been brought to me by others since I've become a public figure around these topics, could have resulted from essentially quantum excursions that have now resulted from the experimental nature of this technology. I don't believe that they were in control of what the side effects would be. I know that in the summer of 1970, when we began teleporting, and then later in fall of 70, when we began essentially being involved in teleportation-based time travel, we had to we studied essentially a script. Or in other words, we were trained in what to say after we found, if we were quantum dislocated upon arriving in New Mexico. Let's say we jumped through the device in 1971, but we got there in 1791. Our universe, at least the immediate universe that we can explore, has basically a rhythm of 20 years. So we had different forms of training to potentially adjust for the fact of the potential outcome of being lost in space and in time. Of course, Lost in Space was a popular TV show of that era, but specifically of being lost in time. And so, for example, we were trained to go to a parish priest or the sheriff or a prominent businessman on the New Mexico side and literally tell this story to be adopted into his household in the event that we jumped through the Tesla teleporter in the early 1970s and ended up in some other time, presumably the past, in New Mexico. We also had to memorize the Santa Fe, New Mexico street plan, because it was expected that on a number of these teleportings we would be dislocated in space. So, for example, one time I popped into view not at the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, but way down near Highway 40 and Cerrillos Road, about 5 miles to the east of the state capitol grounds, and had to find my way all the way up to the Baton Memorial Building, which was essentially the collection area where they were trying to teleport us. So in terms of the mere quantum effect of what we were doing, it was dangerous and experimental. These were new technical applications. within the defense technical community. But if you're asking, do I think that there may have been not just damage to us physically, but damage to the time-space continuum in ways that could not be predicted, I would answer in the affirmative to both of those. So, for example, in terms of medical side effects, we now know that the adult teleportees were developing heart valve defects, and the child teleportees of that era were developing later in life a disease of metabolic regulation that mimics diabetes. And so hopefully in the intervening 45, almost going on 50 years now, they have rectified those side effects. And so I'm calling for the declassification of Tesla teleportation, or Vortal teleportation, if you will, in real time, if in the intervening now almost 50 years the U.S. government has made it safe. But it certainly wasn't safe when we were doing it back in the late 60s and early 70s.
You mentioned the work that David Paulides is doing with these mysterious disappearances. Do you believe that by opening these portals in time and space to send Andy Basiago back in time, is there a repercussive wave that might open somewhere else that's sucking somebody in? Do you believe that might be the play, or do you believe that some of these people that are quote unquote missing are part of the project that's continuing and ongoing?
No, I don't believe the latter is happening, but I'm suggesting that the former may have happened. I mean, my father was a project principal. He was the chief technical consultant between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of Tesla teleportation. I had the privilege of meeting other project principals like Dr. Agnew, like Dr. Sterling Colgate, like Dr. Iben Browning when he was the director of science and technology for CIA. And I can certainly now provide testimony that, like many scientists and engineers of that era, these were the individuals who brought us the atomic bomb, for example. The same individuals, not my father, but certainly in the case of individuals like Dr. Agnew, Dr. Edward Teller was on the project. They possessed that Promethean confidence in high technology that defined the technical attitude, if you will, the worldview of the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw would later call them. And I can certainly say that when I would listen to their shop talk, let's say at lunch in Albuquerque, they didn't seem, I can now understand as an adult, that they didn't seem to really possess any negative capability about what they might be creating by opening up these tunnels in time space. And so I'm just citing David Paulides' work in the sense that, you know, when people go into the woods, we hope they come out. And if they don't come out of the woods, I mean, there's sort of an age-old fear that they've been killed by a wild animal or what have you. So we're kind of vigilant when people go into the woods and don't come out. And that was the initial focus of David's brilliant research. I think that we can't discount the possibility that we're just noticing people who've gone missing in the woods, because we don't notice people going missing in such an obvious way in urban areas, if in fact there were quantum side effects that were created by this project. I don't know that happened, but I'm opening up the possibility. I'm leaving open the possibility because in the sense that generation had such confidence in high technology that they were moving ahead so that we would occupy the high road, the high frontier of time space, come hell or high water, you know, the side effects be damned. And so we know there were medical side effects, and I'm suggesting one of the things we want to explore is, were there quantum side effects that now in our time may be leading to at least some of these disappearances?
When you were sent back and forth in these different instances, were you sent with an objective aside from just viewing and witnessing? Were you supposed to interact with people of that time era? Were you supposed to share intelligence or information? Talk to us just very quickly about what your, what your goals were.
Project Pegasus was primarily an intelligence program. We were being sent to non-local places in time space, to the past and then ultimately to the future, to gather better intelligence about past events and conditions and future events and conditions, so that the U.S. government could do something very responsible, so that our military could do something very responsible. And I'm honored, I might add, to be here tonight with Major General Mark Musick, whose recent book with Doug Wellman about Howard Hughes actually crosses timelines with my story in some very interesting ways. But what that very responsible work was to be able to engage in current contingency planning for present and future events as a result of knowing more about the past and being able to predict more of what the future held. So I don't want to underemphasize the urgency of Project Pegasus. It was a noble project, and it was looking out for all of us, because after all, the primary goal of the defense technical community of that generation was to prevent nuclear war, to not have to wage nuclear war, and instead achieve both survival and peace on the one hand, and the maintenance of our freedom on the other, in light of the Cold War tensions that existed. So we were primarily gathering intelligence because, look, by the time I was officially brought into Project Pegasus in fall of 1969, a couple of months after the lunar landing, as a 7-year-old going on age 8 in September there, the technologies already existed. And they weren't so much, while they were training us in different technologies, they were really giving us alpha intelligence training, martial arts training, such as my friend and colleague William Whitecrow, who I'm also honored to be on with tonight, can discuss how we were being trained in how to survive while we were time traveling by mastering martial arts. So it was primarily an intelligence gathering program, and then only secondarily a time travel program.
Now, you have also made claims that you were part of the teleportation program to Mars. I'm curious, with all of the questions and the fact that trying to get through the Van Ryan belt and dealing with issues with gamma radiation and other issues that are still in the forefront of space travel and are problematic, and why a lot of people believe we haven't continued our journey to the moon and beyond with manned crews. Do you believe that the lunar landing physically took place, meaning we launched from planet Earth and we landed on the moon, or was the launch a red herring for teleportation, putting them on the moon?
I can only answer by affirming the latter, in the sense that I know from my my work on the Mars Jump Room program in the early 80s, I was asked, along with some of the other young people being trained in summer of 1980 at College of the Siskiyous, to analyze about a 4-inch thick dossier from the French External Intelligence Agency of information about the humanoid civilization on Mars, their indigenous aboriginal civilization, if you will. And those documents contained an anecdote that American astronauts first landed on Mars in 1964. 5 years before the lunar landing. So especially in light of the fact that my own father received the FBI background check to work on the instrumentation for the lunar module, but that contract was not secured by Parsons. I think either Grumman or Jacobs got that contract, which was a great disappointment. My dad wanted to work on the lunar landing. So I'm of the mind that the lunar landing happened, or that when it was contrived in July of 1969, they were concealing the fact that we had already been not just to the moon but Mars, because I know from those French intelligence documents that they were just simply categorically stating that that the American presence on Mars in the modern era began in no later than 1964. So I don't know exactly how the lunar landing of July 20th, 1969 falls together, but certainly we had the capability. Now, regarding the Van Allen belt, I'm not a physicist today. I'm a lawyer and a public speaker, a public figure, but I can say that, I'm 55 and I'm still alive. William Whitecrow went up to Mars before I did, actually in the late 70s, not the early 80s. And I believe that William is 63 and we're still alive. So clearly it wasn't the healthiest thing in the world to endure the jump room process itself. I mean, we were literally being twisted physically as we were going up there in the jump room, which was essentially a space elevator. But we're still alive. So here's two people appearing on your show tonight, Dave, who are still quite alive in their 50s and 60s, even though we were both teleporting back in the late 60s, early 70s in Pegasus, and then going up to Mars numerous times. I mean, I myself went up around, 40 times, 40 round trips via jump room, I would estimate. So I think that the Van Allen belt danger, I think, is a bit of a red herring. It clearly can't be good for human health, but it certainly wasn't a a game changer in any significant way.
Yeah, but I would guess if what they're doing is, in a sense, kind of folding space-time to put you from here to there, that by folding that time and your exposure through the Van Allen belt would be so minimal that there really wouldn't be much of an effect.
I mean, that's my view. I mean, we certainly didn't feel any effect.
But you're on Mars. Was it breathable? Were you in a special suit? And were you sent with a team, or were you sent individually?
Well, we either went up by ourselves or with one other, and because the oxygen inside the jump room itself was limited, we typically constrained the number of jumpers to no more than 3, and then we would meet up on the surface. Let me say that Mars does have an atmosphere. I was informed by Courtney Hunt of the CIA, one of the fellow jumpers and one of the training officers, that the oxygen on Mars is leaching from its lithosphere. Basically, the oxygen is just being released chemically from its rocks. Oxygen is a clear gas, and clear gases refract blue. So as I stated before, it was shown in NASA's rover data from Mars, Mars has a baby blue colored sky. Well, Mars has not reddish skies, but blue skies. Now, the oxygen levels were not high. So, for example, after, let's say, 2 hours walking around on the surface, I would get screaming pain in my legs from hypoxia, from the undersupply of oxygen. I also had the experience of carrying one of my colleagues in on my shoulder for about a mile, maybe a half a mile at least, one day on one mission where he collapsed, presumably from hypoxia or stress or some other cause, and I had to do a fireman's carry of a 160-pound adult a half a mile or a mile or so into one of the jump rooms. And I'm telling you, imagine carrying that much weight in an atmosphere that's kind of what Earth's atmosphere is at, let's say, 14,000 feet. I mean, it was very thin air. It was difficult to breathe there. In fact, we were in our training, and when we did our first jumps, we were given an oxygen mask that we then took off, and if we could breathe, we pretty much dispensed with and didn't take it on our jumps. But they had provided for an artificial oxygen supply because the oxygen there is very thin, but it's substantial enough to produce blue skies. And so it is ultimately a planetary environment that's habitable by human beings from Earth.
All right. I know we've got, as you mentioned, we have Major Mark Musick and William Whitecrow with us. We're going to introduce them in a moment. We have to take a quick break. We'll come back. We've got more about time travel and who did our guests bring to corroborate these stories and shed some insight on it. We'll discuss that when we return. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more inside look at time travel when we return to Beyond the Darkness.
Beyond the Darkness.
Welcome back. This is Beyond the Darkness, your home for the best in paranormal talk radio 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. You can check us out here at podcast1.com. Or for those of you checking us out through iTunes, do us a big favor. Make sure you check out and rate and review the show. The more rates and reviews, the better. And we get exposed to more and more people. You love the show. Share it with your friends, relatives, and more. Share Beyond the Darkness. Our guest this evening, Andrew Basiago. He is a time traveler. He is an attorney and hopefully will be our next president in 2020, Tim. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Well, yeah.
And he is part of the Truther movement, the Truth movement, I should say. And he's brought a couple of guests with tonight. We heard about some of Andrew's background and what he was involved with. Let's take a few seconds now, if you would, Andy, and introduce us to Major Mark Musick.
It's my privilege because really tonight we're going to be making history. Major General Mark Musick and his co-author Douglas Wellman are the recent authors of a fascinating biography of Howard Hughes, the legendary aviator and industrialist, entitled Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. And I was motivated to contact them because I had contact with Howard Hughes both as the child when I was serving on DARPA's Project Pegasus, specifically the year 1970, and again in the early 1980s when I was serving on the CIA's Mars Jumper program. So I reached out to them, and what we ended up comparing notes on was astounding. It was one of those rare times when independent researchers, by consulting with each other, develop new information in light of the separate research tracks that they've been on. I think in the case of all three of us for many, many years. So I'm happy to introduce Mark Musick, and I'm sure you'll be fascinated by their thesis, which is essentially that Hughes's death was faked in 1976, and in fact he lived on to the year 2001. But during that time, he was more closely connected to the U.S. time-space research and development activities of that era, the very activities that I've been narrating all these years. So I'm happy to introduce Major General Mark Musick.
Major General Mark Musick, thank you for joining us this evening.
Andy, thank you.
I've got to ask you, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. This is an interesting discussion this evening.
It is. Now, you're putting together a book and research on Howard Hughes, a legendary American figure here, and suddenly Andy Basiago reaches out to you and starts talking about time travel and these moments of contact. How does this hit you at first? I mean, is this something that sounds too unbelievable to be true, or with what you had found in your research, did this make a lot of sense?
Well, what we have found, Douglas Wellman and I have worked now for 14 years on a story, and the story is that Howard Hughes did not die in 1976. That was a stand-in that died. Howard Hughes is living under another identity provided by the CIA, and he lived under that identity from about 1969, from what we know, on to his death in 2001. And that's certainly not what history says is Howard Hughes's life. History says the end of his life was very, very strange. He was a 100-pound, 90-pound, basically drug-addicted derelict, long-haired, long fingernails. That man was a stand-in for Howard. Howard was actually a very healthy man living with a woman named Eva McClelland, who they met in Panama, and they were married in May of 1970. And they lived as husband and wife until the end of 2001. Eva McClelland kept the secret. She did not know really who he was at the beginning because he looked different, had a different name, and so forth. But she kept the secret after she figured it out, and then he revealed it to her. We do know that Howard had quite a strong connection to the CIA. So when Andy got a hold of us and talked about this program he was involved with, things seemed to fit in that scenario that he was talking about.
All right, and you hear this though. You're obviously, from your title, part of the military. Is it surprising to you to find out that there is this teleportation and time travel project that has been taking place and was effective, was not just a work of science fiction, but that it was taking place?
Well, that's funny because when Andy first contacted Doug and myself, it took us probably a good 2 months to get our head around this program that he was talking about. Mm-hmm. But from the viewpoint of Howard Hughes, what we had known about Howard Hughes and learned about him, and we continue to get information back on him. He was a very interesting man, a genius, basically, and he was involved with so many different projects, many of them all connected with the CIA, that this program, Andy said, especially when Andy said that he met him in the early 80s, 1982, 83, 84 timeframe, and he was connected with this program. That began to make sense because Howard would just disappear as he was married to Eva. There'd be times that he'd just disappear, and there'd be times that she would leave him also because he was hard to live with. And so for him to be able to travel somewhere and have meetings or be involved with government programs is not very surprising to us because it seemed like he would be able to do that based on these time frames that he would just be gone from his wife.
What was the theory of why he would fake his own death? Why would he put somebody who was obviously starting to tarnish the good name and thoughts of Howard Hughes by this long nail ice cream loving hermit version of himself. You would think that ego alone would keep Howard Hughes from wanting that to be the representation of who he became.
Oh, that's a very good question, because Howard was a very, very reclusive man, very reclusive. And the last picture was taken about 1953, I think it was, and he just kind of disappeared from the public in the early 50s. He was working on many, many different programs. He had a lot of government contracts that he was working on, and he was working on many, many different things, but he was a very secretive man. He was a very reclusive man. And so it's kind of his nature to do that. And then I think as he got more and more involved with things of the CIA, for instance, in 1968, a Soviet submarine sank, and the CIA went to Howard and said, "Will you help raise this submarine?" And he said, "Yes, I'll do it." That was right at the same time that we were speculating at this point, but it's right at the same time that he started with this new identity, an identity of a man named Werner Nicely, who was also a CIA operative. And so we have Howard taking, as connected to the CIA, operating many CIA programs, now taking that identity of a CIA gentleman who basically disappeared in the late 60s. And so Howard had a lot of reasons, I think, to want to hide, and he found a way to do it. Of course, he had the money to do it. He was the richest man in America, possibly the richest man in the world. So he had all the money that he needed. He found a lady that loved him, that kept a secret, and he found there was a stand-in there that he found to kind of add confusion into the situation. And so he had the perfect setup there to be able to just disappear.
All right, so he effectively kind of does this strange meld out and allows somebody else to take visible responsibility for his life while he's doing this covert programs. And you talk about in the 50s how he kind of vanished from public eye. Now, the research that you've done, Andy Basiago, and having been a part of Project Pegasus, do you believe that maybe Hughes was part of this program from the beginning, and that maybe when he was leaving the public eye, it was the fact that he was time traveling? I mean, he always seemed very advanced in his thoughts and business prowess, and like he had some kind of sixth sense about what could happen and what couldn't. Do you think that maybe he was part of this project from the get-go?
No, but I can actually identify two very important data points, and I almost feel like, to some extent, I mean, I couldn't be. I'm as pleased as punch, as they used to say back in the day, that I'm able to provide these two data points to investigators as dogged and tireless and responsible as Mark and Doug have been. Because here's the data points that I can provide. In 1970, I was a child participant in Pegasus, and in fact, it was in summer of 70 when we began teleporting back and forth across the country between New Jersey and New Mexico as a group of children. My father had social ties to Old Town Albuquerque that went back to 1953-54 when he went out there for Curtiss Wright to flight test the ramjet engine at White Sands. And one day at the La Hacienda restaurant, where my dad's lifelong friend and former girlfriend, Connie Chavez, was the cashier and sometimes waitress, there was a VIP that my dad announced would be feted there that day at lunch by about maybe 3 tables of people, maybe about 12 adult participants in Project Pegasus. My father and I did not sit at the table that the guest was at, but I kept on plying my dad for who he was and what his identity was and what was and even what the term VIP meant. And my dad said proudly, "Very important person," but he wouldn't give me the name of the gentleman sitting at the other table. And so I asked Connie Chavez, my dad's old friend, and I remember her whispering in my ear, "He's Howard Hughes. He's a famous aviator and filmmaker, and he built this big wooden boat called the Spruce Goose." And so I know that Howard Hughes was a VIP guest of the U.S. Time-Space program at the La Hacienda restaurant in 1970. Now, I find out by conversing with Mark Musick and Douglas Wellman that it was in 1970 that Howard Hughes went back to Alabama, where this third wife, this sort of girlfriend or wife from the latter part of his life, Eva McClellan, lived. And she stated to them during their investigation of Hughes's secret life that when she asked him where he had been, he said he was hanging out with some, she thought he had said, stargazers with a Z. And so I said to Mark and Doug, no, you know what I think he must have said? I think he said stargaters. Because Hughes, of course, had this secret identity. We can speculate that perhaps, I mean, they're the authors of the book, so I don't want to overreach here, but we can speculate that maybe while working on sensitive defense projects like the Glomar Explorer, like the Mars Jump Room program, that Hughes was speaking even in sort of subtle terminology or by inference, so to speak, by innuendo, even when conversing with his then wife, Eva. And so that instead of saying, well, I was in New Mexico dealing with the principals on this DARPA CIA project called Project Pegasus that's developed time travel, he used sort of shorthand and said, well, I was hanging out with some stargaters. And the reason I think that's what he said is that only 2 years later in 1972, Project Pegasus built a huge Stargate device. A Stargate is a real device. It's not a natural phenomenon. It is a device. It's an advanced time travel technology. That Stargate, which was pretty much a big gate that we were running up on a ramp and through a neon blue portal in the bottom center of this huge black gate, was constructed on the basketball court at the Cerrillos Cultural Center complex in Cerrillo, New Mexico, southeast of Santa Fe. That complex was built by the WPA during the Great Depression. A summer earlier, in summer of 71, they had built the chronovisor, the electro-optical device where they were sending me over and over again to a specific past event, which was the Lincoln assassination site at Ford's Theater on April 14th of 1865 to try to see specifically who shot President Lincoln. There were theories that it was not John Wilkes Booth, but maybe it was even his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. So in the summer of 1972, I was and the other children were running up this ramp through this Stargate device to get to the year 2045, where we were entering an intelligence community office building somewhere in the country. They wouldn't tell us. And we were retrieving microfilm summaries of events occurring between the mid-1970s and the mid-2040s. We were then jumping through a teleport at that location and popping back into view around the microwave tower array west of the Continental Divide site, the so-called Lobo Overlook site, where you can go for 3 miles west from the Continental Divide sign there and go up to the microwave tower array, up Microwave Tower Road, and hence find ourselves back in 1972. In fact, it was explained to us that that particular facility was actually pinging microwaves into the cosmos so that the program in the future, in the year 2045, a year they had selected because it was a century after the end of World War II and the advent of the atomic age, could identify where we had come from in time space and set us back. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that Project Pegasus had developed a Stargate by 1972. I remember seeing Hughes in the restaurant as not only a very bright but an intuitive child. I remember noticing, for example, how he had a habit of kind of furrowing his brow and sort of talking from underneath his brow. How he looked, to me, he looked kind of shy, somewhat reserved. He was doing a lot of listening. Obviously, he was a guest of honor, so with his shy and recondite personality, it was probably always difficult for him to be feted in this way. But what I'm saying here is that my memories of serving in Pegasus directly link up, I believe, with this particular anecdote that is shared by Mark and Doug in their fascinating study of the secret life of Howard Hughes. So the first data point that links Howard Hughes to Project Pegasus is simply the fact that he was a guest of honor. I know it was Hughes. I mean, even if Mark and Doug were to reject my premise that I was in a time travel program, I know what I did in the program, and I can say without the slightest bit of compunction that it was Hughes. And in fact, my father was reluctant to give me his name, I think because he didn't want me to speak out of class and blab his name and embarrass my father. And again, we were not sitting at the table that Hughes was sitting at. Some higher individuals, higher mucky mucks on the project had the honor of sitting with Hughes. So this means that Hughes was essentially brought into Project Pegasus, at least on a consultative basis, in 1970. And it's interesting that Mark cites 1969 as sort of the beginning of Hughes' secret life with Eva McClellan, because then I meet him in 70 when I'm just having my initial experiences on the project. And, that period that essentially comprised the first Nixon administration, 1968, 69 to 72, that was really the heyday of Project Pegasus, back when we were developing different forms of time travel. So what I can provide, the first data point I can provide, is that Howard Hughes was a guest of honor by the very people who were cobbling together a U.S. time-space exploration capability. If you consider his career, what was he ultimately? Ultimately, Howard Hughes was an inventor of airplanes. And what I'm alleging, and what I'm sharing with Mark and with Douglas, is that I believe that it was the goal of Project Pegasus to allow Howard Hughes to further his career in advanced aeronautics, because we know in the second data point that he had an office at the West Coast Jump Room facility 10 years later in the early 80s, as not just somebody who was consulted about the U.S. time-space capability, but who's somebody who was literally working on the Mars Jump Room program. And William Whitecrow and I had the opportunity to meet Howard Hughes several times in that building. The building is still there. It's at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, the very town in Southern California that Hughes Aircraft has always been located, but not that building, a building much closer to the Los Angeles International Airport. So here we have Hughes being essentially feted by Project Pegasus. I remember watching him smiling. I could see gestures of disbelief on his face. I think it was at that lunch in 1970 that he was told how far our time travel capability had gone by then. It was his first briefing, and I think it created the connection to the project that William Whitecrow and I can corroborate.
Well, let me ask the Major General Mark Musick again real quickly. So you're able to find, in your belief, the fact that Howard Hughes did live until 2001. What kind of corroborative evidence do you have to prove that this man was, in fact, Howard Hughes, and he was not the stand-in?
Oh, that's an excellent question. We started the research of this book in 2002, and with Eva McClellan's story. And honestly, I didn't believe her. I thought it was just craziness is what she did. But then we went back, and I started going back. And the thing I noticed in my dialogue with her is nothing ever changed with her story. No words, nothing ever changed. And then I went back and started confirming. I went back to where they lived. I went back to look at birth certificates. We went back and got medical records. We got military records. And everything begins to come together. And then we have people who came to us and provided additional information with it. And so we just, it's like a big jigsaw puzzle. And you begin to put piece together, and it all begins to make sense. We went back and spoke to the family of the man whose identity that he took, and found out that he basically disappeared in the 60s, and his brother didn't know what happened to him. And so when you begin to piece this thing together, and then you look at the physical characteristics, the identity that he took was a man who was 5'11". His name's Werner Nicey. He was 5'11". This man that Eva McClellan married, referred to his name as Nick Nickley, was 6'4". And we had many people tell us his height. We had many people give us his physical condition. And then he told certain people he was Howard Hughes. He told certain people about him being with flying the Hercules, the Spruce Goose, and growing up in Texas and so forth. And so as you begin to put these pieces together, everything begins to fit on it.
Well, but with that said, there are people that you can find that are homeless on the street that'll tell you they're Napoleon and firmly believe it, and their story won't change because in their mind they believe what their experience is that it's a reality. By going on word of mouth and kind of secondary tales, doesn't that fall? I mean, in a court of law, that would totally fall apart, right?
Well, we're not in a court of law, though.
Right.
And so what we did, you get other information. Then when the first book came out in 2010, other people began to come to us. Howard Hughes supposedly had no biological children. We have, in the second edition of the book, we have two biological children who interacted with Howard younger. And then we've had other people who have come to us and give us additional information on it. And so as you just keep putting piece and piece together, this is the conclusion that you come to, is that Howard Hughes wanted to hide, and we've got documents that all back this up. Howard Hughes wanted to hide, found a way to do it, found a stand-in who was about 20 years older than him, who actually was a stand-in that died in 2000 and in 1976. And then if you actually look in the 72 and 73 about the records and the media regarding Howard Hughes, you go between this long-haired, long-fingered, drug-addicted derelict man, and you go between a charming, handsome, in-charge man who is meeting with the president of Nicaragua, the governor of Nevada, who flies airplanes and things like that. So even you have a glimpse in the 70s, 72, 73, that there's two different men here. There's absolutely two different men. And it doesn't all come together until Eva McClellan comes forward and says, you know what, I was married to Howard Hughes and he didn't die in 1976. I actually lived with him until 2001.
And once he passed away, was it of natural causes?
When Howard actually died, he developed a cancer on the left side of his head. Eva first noticed it in 1993. And he developed a cancer on the left side of his head, and she wanted him to go take care of it. She wanted him to go take care of it, and he would never do it. And that cancer just grew and grew and grew. He's got some. He went into the VA medical facility in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1999, 2000, 2001, of which we have those records about that. And he went in there, and he declined in health at that point in time, and finally passed away then in November of 2001.
Was he buried?
He was cremated. I wish he was buried, but he was cremated. You know, I've worked DNA on this for 5 years, and I wish we could get it, but we haven't had the luck in getting it. We have done DNA on his children, though, and we have a strong match on two of the children whose father was Howard. They both believe their father was Howard Hughes.
Okay, but would that put them into being born after his supposed death?
No, one was born in 1942, a gentleman named John, and then a daughter named Cindy was born in 1957. And he actually interacted with them in their younger life. We found he had several children that he actually interacted with in their younger life. So they also had to put the pieces together of who is my father. And then people told them, well, your father's Howard Hughes. And then they kept that because they couldn't do anything with it, basically.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Major General Mark Musick. We appreciate you sharing this. And the name of your book, so our listeners can find it?
The name of the book is Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. And it's named Boxes because Eva McClellan wanted it named Boxes because she lived from boxes. She really couldn't unpack because they kept moving and moving and moving, and he would really not let her unpack. When I met her in 2002, she basically had boxes all through her apartment. She was still basically living from boxes, and that's why she wanted to name that, because that's how she lived with him. They had to be able to leave quickly, and they had to be able to disappear whenever he wanted to.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll put up a link for Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. Andy, do you believe that possibly this cancer that he was dealing with on the left side of his brain, could this have been an after effect of the time travel technology?
Well, it wasn't happening.
No, what I think it was.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
what I
go
think
ahead,
it was,
Major.
he had an aircraft accident in 1946. Yeah, he had an aircraft accident in 1946. And in that, he had severe burns. In fact, Nick's feet were burned, his hands were burned, they were damaged. He was actually getting salve from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute there where they lived in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might have been a residual of his accident that he had in 1946 and part of the burns.
All right. And Andy, are there other surviving members? I know that you're in good health, William White Crow in good health. Are there other surviving members, though, of the jump room experiments and the time travel experiments that were impacted by strange health maladies because of the work that you were doing?
Well, let me just say in prescript, I'm not suggesting that Howard Hughes was a participant in time traveling, either in Pegasus in the 70s or later in the Mars jump room, although it's conceivable that he may have made a jump to Mars just because many of the technicians on the project were. My own father did one jump in May of 1984, even though his cardiac and pulmonary systems were compromised. He actually went up with a medical orderly. But I do think it's another it's something that there's strong circumstantial evidence that we were medically injured. For example, apropos of the question of the disruption of metabolic performance, we have lost one of the early time travelers, Glenn Pruitt, the son of Carl Jack Pruitt of the U.S. Navy, died in around 2005 of congestive heart disease and pulmonary edema after reaching 700 pounds of weight.
Wow.
As a result of this syndrome. And I have his father, Jack Pruitt, and Glenn to thank for meeting with me in Santa Fe in June of 2003, where they advised me to adopt a calorie-restricted diet to avoid obesity linked to this pattern of metabolic disruption among the jumpers. So I've done so, not to the best that I could have, but I've controlled my weight. Many of the early time travelers have diabetes. Some of us have developed congestive heart disease and have had issues of edema that seem to be related to the metabolic and cardiac impacts. And of course, I mentioned that the adult participants of that era who were teleporting were developing at that time heart valve defects because their cardiac tissues were more rigid than the tissues of the children involved. So, for example, my dad survived during the last 13 years of his life with a synthetic mitral valve because of the loss of actually the fusion of his mitral valve in a way that his distinguished cardiac surgeon, Hector Sestatus, could not explain. He actually came out of my dad's I guess it was his second open heart surgery in the early 80s, and it explained this strange fusing of my dad's mitral valve in his heart and the medical need to replace it with a St. Jude's cuff. So just in my own family, I've struggled with this metabolic syndrome, and my dad's life was foreshortened by the heart valve defect that the adult teleportees were developing.
Let me take you back real quickly to the comments of Nixon. Was our President Nixon aware of these projects at that time?
I think he must have been because he was commander-in-chief. Doesn't
that seem strange to you then? I mean, let's face it, time travel is an absolute power. And we know one thing time and time again, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You've got Tricky Dicky Nixon getting busted at good God, not Whitewater. Tim, help me out here. Watergate. Why would he not have said, hey, send that Basiago kid back to shut the door? Why not send a time traveler back to fix the damn thing so he doesn't get all the trouble he went through? And it would be a simple fix. Send somebody back and shut the door. Right?
Well, I can give you the easy answer and then a far more difficult response.
Please.
The easy answer is that he would have been advised by the program principals that when you send somebody back in time, because you have the collapse of the wave function in the present, when a present event becomes a past event, you can't go back and change a past event, because after all, if somebody is in the present, which is the past future, is sent back to prevent an event, they're there when the event happens, right? And so their presence doesn't obviate the event. So he would have been told, well, Mr. Nixon, we can't go back and put the tape on or take tape off or there at the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, or whatever they would want to hide, because you can't go back and change a past event. You can only affect the present in the past. And I could go on for about an hour of why that's so, but that's actually how retrocausation works.
That's kind of the grandfather effect, right? Because again, if you were able to send yourself back in time to kill your grandfather, you wouldn't have existed to begin with, so it would have never happened. You'd have created a paradox.
Yeah, after all, if in summer of 73 he had sent Hunt, McCord, or Liddy back via teleportation-based time travel to undo what they did, they would have been there when they did what they did, right? So it would have happened anyway. Okay, now the difficult answer, again, comes from a source within the Mars Jump Room program, and that's our colleague Bernard Mendez, Benny Mendez, as he's been known over the years in the military intelligence community. Benny Mendez has stated that Richard Nixon, as president, was actually trying to shut down the abuse of the information about future events that resulted from the U.S. time-space program. And he was ensnared in a scandal, namely the Watergate controversy, that was artificially propagated to drive him from office. So I'm not making a case for a revisionist reconstruction of the career or reputation of Richard Milhouse Nixon. But I'm just saying that so much has been kept back that we're not even capable of evaluating the moral choice-making of our presidents, because that's, in fact, Mendez's testimony, that Nixon was disturbed that billion-dollar fortunes were being created by current knowledge of future events as a result of individuals connected to the project, violating the vow that they took when they joined Project Pegasus to not privateer on any of the information about future events. And when Nixon began to try to shut down that kind of cheating, that kind of privateering, he was hounded from office in a fabricated conspiracy, one fabricated actually by the CIA itself. Okay, so I don't know whether that's true. I'm just providing Benny's testimony.
So you mean
regard.
Poor Nixon was under fake news at that time?
Well, I mean, if you look at the controversiality of his administration of that era, I think we would all admit that we can't necessarily trust the Dan Rather interpretation of Nixon's duplicity and what he was driven from office for, because after all, this project literally defined the most advanced defense technical project of his first administration. And I'm sure he must have known, and we have to ask whether Nixon would have been concerned enough about the country and the abuse of its defense technical findings and community to take such action. And I've concluded that he might have done so. I think, like Carter, I think he was very involved in specific matters. I don't want to call him a control freak, but my study of Nixon indicates that he was a very engaged president, and I think he might have become disturbed by the implications of people creating billion-dollar fortunes by exploiting the information about future events and conditions that the project was accumulating.
I can time travel right now. Everyone knows we pre-record the show earlier in the week to air later. And I know if I don't ask this follow-up question before we go to William White Crow, I'm going to be abused violently by email and social media. So they sent you back on a few projects to go back to the time of Lincoln's assassination to try to determine if there was a different assassin other than John Wilkes Booth. You brought up the fact that it was even speculated at one time that it could have been Mary Todd Lincoln. First of all, my question to you is, what did they think a child was going to do to be able to get near the box of Lincoln to corroborate who shot who? How would you have had the credentials to get up that close to see and witness it? And secondly, who killed Lincoln?
Well, what had happened was that after they developed the chronovisors, these are the electro-optical devices that create moving holographic cubes, basically, of past and future events. They began to take the lives of particular prominent individuals such as Jesus of Nazareth, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln, because they wanted to compare what the chronovisors were imaging with what written text showed about the lives of those individuals. Mm-hmm. Now, the benefit of sending a child is, first of all, the Civil War was an era in which there were children roaming the countryside because there was so much social dislocation. There were even child warriors. not just fife players and drummers, but even child soldiers. And there was a lot of social dislocation that caused children to be orphaned and essentially wandering the countryside. So kids were living kind of tough, kind of rough during the Civil War era. They were often looking out for themselves, in other words.
So wait, were you there via the chronovisor, or were you there in a physical form? Chronovisor, as my understanding, is you were basically immersed in a 4D movie where you were able to wear this reality visor to see and witness, but you were not there physically to interact.
Oh, no. Actually, the chronovisor had begun as like a TV-like screen of past events when it was developed by Ernetti, Gemelli, and then Fermi in the 40s and 50s. But by the time I was brought into the chronovisor activities in 1970, they basically propagated a cube of light on the stage. So if we were standing on the stage when that cube of light was illuminated around us, we subjectively experienced going to that, usually that past event, but also sometimes future events. So I was sent bodily those numerous times to the Lincoln assassination site. Other advantages would be that kids would be ignored. Lincoln's door was guarded. I had this in the training for this jump by one guard. In fact, he was derelict in his duties and was not at that door when John Wilkes Booth entered. So kids would be ignored.
Okay.
It was a way of talking my way past the ticket table at the front of the front lobby of the theater. Saying that my parents had already been admitted, and I was dressed kind of as a society kid in a fancy kind of Little Lord Fauntleroy kind of finery that I found very embarrassing to be dressed in that jump. When I went to see the Gettysburg Address, they dressed me as a Union Bugle Boy. I liked that costume a lot more. But anyway, so kids wouldn't be noticed. Kids wouldn't necessarily be shooed away if they were in a position of possible danger to the president. And also, just generally, as a matter of sort of the epistemology of travel, they wanted to work with children because they found in their human factors research that children are more reliable in understanding what they're actually looking at because they're tabula rasa, they're blank slates. That is to say that their perceptions are less colored than the perceptions of adults because their perceptions are not colored by what they've already encountered in life and what they presuppose they're looking at.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, so actually children we were sought as individuals who could provide better intelligence when we were time traveling. And also, of course, we'd have the advantage of not being challenged. If we were sent in, for example, I once teleported into a Parsons job site in Saudi Arabia when we were training to do espionage in Saudi. Now, some 8-year-old kid who could say, well, my dad works for the Ralph M. Parsons site over at Yanbu would be less likely to be, tortured to death or imprisoned for life or something or hanged than an adult spy. So there was also an espionage dimension here, and
that makes sense, right? I follow you on that. So, who did kill Lincoln? What were you guys able to ascertain from being there?
What I've been saying for years about that. Yeah, what I've been saying for years about that jump actually, again, helps prove the historicity of what I've been claiming. You may have heard on some of my interviews, if you heard any of them, that I was describing how there was something almost disembodied about going to the Lincoln assassination site, because every time I went up to his booth, their balcony seating from behind, from that hallway that goes behind there, and you can look in at where they were sitting, they were never there. And then I found out on Facebook by somebody who knew the Lincoln assassination better than I had ever learned it by going there, that the Lincolns were late for the theater that night. I only saw, in the 7 or 8 times I was sent there, I once saw the Lincolns coming in the lobby with Mrs. Lincoln ahead of Lincoln, and he was very emaciated. And I once got back there and saw them sitting in their balcony seating. The other times I was either shooed away by a guard or there was no guard there and the Lincolns weren't there. And then I found out from somebody on Facebook that the Lincolns came to the theater about 15 to 30 minutes late that night. The play, Our American Cousin, starring Laura Keene, was stopped, and the whole cast of the play and the audience serenaded the Lincolns. And then Mr. Lincoln said something like, let the play continue. So when I was sent there, from the chronovisor array at the Cerrillos Cultural Center in summer of 71, over and over again to try to complete that mission of seeing what happened, who shot Mr. Lincoln, I was being sent there too early because the Lincolns hadn't arrived yet. And now I know that's in fact what explains the sort of disembodied atmosphere of going there because the Lincolns were never there, and that's why they had sent me there to see who shot him. So I never ended up seeing him being shot. The theory was actually that Mrs. Lincoln was both angry at him and basically crazy. You know, she was committed to a mental asylum by her son Robert Todd Lincoln shortly after the death of her husband, and or that she was angry because he was having an extramarital affair, and that she took her one-shot Derringer out of her purse and placed it to the back of his head and shot him. About the time that John Wilkes Booth was going up there, because somebody might have said, well, Mr. Booth, the president would like to meet you. Maybe you can exchange autographs or whatever. And that maybe he said something besides sic semper tyrannis, or such is the fate of tyrants, when he leapt off the balcony. Maybe he was leaping from the balcony to save his life. Anyway, they just wanted to see whether what I would capture in a first-person viewing of the assassination, how that would compare to what history had told in written sources. And that's what really the thrust of all of the chronovisor jumps was to compare what we saw holographically in real time as a result of being sent to those mostly past events, with what books and diaries and letters and so forth told about those events.
All right, let's go. Very patient man. We've got William Whitecrow online with us. Introduce Mr. Whitecrow. Let us know a little bit about his story.
Well, Mr. Whitecrow is a remarkable human being. I've known him since I was in the 5th grade. William's only 7 years older than me, so he was about 18 and had already done a 2-year tour of Vietnam as a soldier, as a U.S. Army soldier. In Pegasus, he was teaching the kids when we reached the 5th grade. He was teaching us a mix of karate and aikido, mostly so that we could stay in control of ourselves when we were time traveling. Emotional control, physical control and balance, and so forth. Situational mastery, which is obviously one of the fruits, or should be one of the fruits, of martial arts training. So he was a participant in Pegasus. He was also a guard on Mars, and so we met up again when we were jumping to Mars in the 1982-83 time frame, I believe. We wouldn't learn that and compare notes on that until summer of 2014, when our mutual friend Ed Shiraki, God bless his memory, he just passed away a few weeks ago, put us together at Williams' residence in Redding, California. And so, like myself, my dad, Major Ed Dames, Howard Hughes, and only a few others, William Whitecrow is one of the few participants in both DARPA's Project Pegasus, basically the advent of time travel inside the U.S. defense technical community, and the Mars Jump Room program. And so I was thrilled when he came forward in 2016, acknowledged that he was my martial arts instructor when I was time traveling for DARPA, gave first-person testimony about the existence of the Mars Jump Room program and our mutual participation in it, and then endorsed me for president. It was really a high honor. And so it's my honor again to introduce to your listeners William Whitecrow.
Mr. Whitecrow, thank you for joining us.
Doing?
Oh, we're doing great, and we appreciate you being
here.
Now, talk to me a little bit about your work into this. How were you introduced into this program?
Well, basically, I'd had a lot of experiences when I was a young individual, young child and everything, and was pretty well groomed into the Project Pegasus program. And I didn't know Andrew during the Project Pegasus time, meaning as a little kid and everything. We were understanding going through the jumps and understanding what was going on there and how to deal with this. I had been working what we call a concept of no mind for a long time, because I was practicing Native American ways and everything when I was younger. So they liked that. Plus, there was other attributes that I had that they liked. I was pretty much an operator on my own. Whatever I did, I was very efficient in everything I did. And when I was involved in the programs, I kind of took a little bit of a leadership role within the kids groups that I was involved in. I like science. I had enjoyed, as all kids do, science fiction as a young kid. And this was something that fascinated me. It was something I needed to be a part of. It was like it was part of who I was. I knew this before. And, there's other things I can talk about later on about that. But also then after I was in the Project Pegasus for a period of time, because of my leadership abilities and everything, I turned around, was taken into the other programs, the Mars Jump Room program, the Secret Space program, as a lot of people call it. The one thing that we never did, we never called ourselves, super soldiers. We were just part of a team, and our motto was this: I may not be the best, but I've worked with the best. And that's how it is in operations. We look at it that way. So actually, to really get into the crux of it, we started jumping in the 1960s, in the late 1960s. The time travel situation, Tesla teleportation projects are full ongoing. And that's when I first actually heard about Howard Hughes. And I heard about him. I hadn't seen him at that time. But I knew he was involved in the program because he funneled a lot of money into these programs. And also at the same time, he was going by the name Nick Lee at the time. So he ended up having an office at the Segundo jump room area. And he was a technical advisor for these individuals, big time, because they could give him a project. I can do this, like the submarine issue when they lost a submarine. They went straight to him. Yeah, I can do that. He just had the technical ability. And what brought him into the program also was the fact that he knew the new technologies that were happening and taking place because of his involvement in the programs. I don't know the whole thing, but I can tell you one thing that I do know about him. He didn't do a lot of phone calls and things of this nature. He worked directly through the CIA satellite, which his company and everything was in control of for his communications. So my situation was, as a young man, once I was in the Project Pegasus program, understood what was going on, I went directly into the Mars program and started training people to be ready. If you jumped from here to Mars, or in a time differential program here where you're jumping to a future or a past date, and something unexpected happened as soon as you came out of that jump into that location, you had to be ready to handle yourself and whatever situation was handled there. But a lot of my aspect of helping people in that program, besides the martial arts, was getting them ready mentally for what they were going to go through. And we, like I said, we have a concept of no mind. Once a person understands, and it's a meditative thing, and it goes deeper than that, way deeper than just meditation. It's understanding when you go into a situation, it's real, 100%. You had to be prepared for it, and kids were great at that. Kids were fantastic. An adult was already predisposed to be a certain way. A kid's mind and a kid's ability to learn was fantastic. And like Andrew had said earlier, we healed better as kids if something happened, a lot quicker. So that's basically how the whole program started for me. And I got into the security aspect of it. So I was able to be in several different programs because I was dealing with scientists jumping when we would jump into different areas for their observation. We call it reconnoitering. We go to the area first before scientists or anybody or Andrew or anybody else went into that particular area, that time zone, just to make sure it was safe.
And when you're doing this, you're jumping in and out of time, you're visiting Mars, you're having these experiences. I mean, what's that like? Does that affect your life going forward in reality? I mean, because we hear about people with near-death experiences and how they don't want to come back. How do you just adapt into the real world? It's hard.
Yeah, I've had a lot of problems with doing that. My wife is sitting over here nodding her head. Because you get used to that. That's who you are. And as you're growing up, this is who you are, and it is hard. I'm not going to deny it. To come back into this time period, after doing all these things and jumps to future, past, and to Mars through teleportation as well, to see the technologies and things going on in the world right now, and you're going, come on, guys, release this technology. We do not need to be at this level where we're at right now. We're all generations we've been kept in loops. And when you come out of these programs, the reality of what's going on with the Secret Praise program, and which is part of a breakaway civilization, basically. They keep themselves totally separate. They reverse engineered technology, Tesla technology, things like this. That's normal life. And when you come into this life, back into this life permanently, it's a kind of a hard thing to deal with because of the psychological nature of what you know and how you've been dealing with life, living moment to moment, teaching people always to be aware, keep your head on a swivel, going to different places and reconnoitering them and things of this nature before anybody else gets there. Boy, that's a life. And it was very exciting. There was a lot of dangerous times, a lot of times where we almost lost it. and we did lose team members and everything because of technical difficulties, as we would say now. But the fact of the matter is, coming back into this existence and living today right now, I became a shaman because of this. I was trained young as that, but I'm deep into this now because people have to understand reality isn't quite what it seems to be. Real reality is far beyond what the average citizen sees.
I'd like to ask a question, which I know is going to be somewhat hard, in the sense that I know you both have an agenda and you want the truth told, and you think that we're ready. I stand on the other side of that fence. I don't think the world is ready to know that time travel exists, because I think, I think there's too many enemies that once they realize this are going to set about cracking it their own way. And with things like WikiLeaks and every other kind of Snowden situation that's going on, it's only a matter of time until somebody else is able to acquire this that doesn't have such a loving look at doing what we're doing and just being visitors to history to mark that history happened as we were told it did. Why? Let me start with you, Mr. Whitecrow. Why do you believe it's important for the truth to come out now, 2017 or 2020, when Andrew Basiago attempts to run for president again?
Okay, well, 100% I'm going to say, from my point of view and what's going on, knowing technically the types of weapon systems and things they have, some things are better left unknown. I'm going to be honest with that right now. The aspects of time travel, things of this nature, anytime you have a time travel event, if anything is changed, you have a ripple effect. And these are bad things, because they need to be corrected and things over time. There's different aspects of this that I know because of the security aspect and what being able to go from one limited program to another and understanding how they work. I think that right now the aspect of teleportation, I'll start with that. Number one, would free us from all of the problems we are having right now with transportation. We could really cut down on the warming effect of the planet. Facts are what's happening with our planet right now, if we quit using everything, is going to continue on for another 100 years or more. So we're going to have to suck it up and deal with that. But the fact of the matter is teleportation would help us tremendously. And also, if people knew, you're right, bad people are out there, and if they got a hold of this technology, they're going to use it for some very negative ways. And as Andrew said before, there was some people in the program during the Nixon era, and still to this time period, that are misusing the information, the intel is coming back for personal gain. So that's really already happened in the program. I think that the reason we need to bring it forward is because to let people know we are a lot farther than you think we are. And in order for us to step up to a new Class 1 or Class 2 type society, we're really going to have to look at this stuff, face up to what it is, and put some serious security measures on it for sure. But facts are, Andrew knows as well as I do, even though that technology is here right now, somebody else is going to invent that too, using different means. There is no doubt about that in my mind. So it's better to bring it out now and control it, for the betterment of mankind than have outlaws out there, jumpers, as we call them, time jumpers. And I've known of a few projects where people had to be shut down and, shall we say, taken out because of that, trying to gain this technology, sell it to other individuals so it can be used for negative purposes.
I appreciate your insight on this, Mr. Whitecrow. Thank you very much for joining us. Andy, you're running for president in 2020 on a platform of truth, justice, the American way. You think that the world needs to know what we're up to. Aren't we even more powerful when we leave the world wondering what we're up to? When you can stand up as the president of the United States and say, and look directly into the eyes of that camera and directly into the eyes of our people and say, let me tell you this, there are wheels in motion and there are things that are going on that are beyond your concept of reality. And I can promise you we are and we always will be one great nation, and we will always succeed. Your fear, your upset, your concern, you can allay that because we know things and we have capabilities of stifling and stopping things. And isn't it just as powerful to kind of have that power and the enemy, and I don't even want to say enemy, people on in other countries are not our enemies. They're just different. And can't we look at these? Can't we leave those people with the idea of, wow, they are confident, they have stuff, they're in gear, without giving away the farm and saying, we can time travel and at any time, Putin, we're coming for you. I mean, we need to give them that kind of concept of just how cowboy we really are.
Well, you've asked a very complex question. And let me make some bright line distinctions just so my positions on these matters aren't misunderstood.
Please.
First of all, if you look at my campaign platform, which I call 100 Proposals, a New Agenda for a New America, in the area of truth, I'm calling for disclosure of the time travel, of the fact that we've achieved time travel via teleportation, via chronovision, etc. But I'm not calling for the declassification of the technology itself. I've said many times that, in my view, involving mass people in mass time travel on mass timelines would lead to mass chaos. I'm calling for something very specific, which is disclosure of the fact that we developed time travel 50 years ago by 2018. We developed certainly teleportation by 50 years before 2018, next year, literally. And that we now need to declassify it because humanity has, as one of its human rights under our common heritage as human beings, the right to know the state of the art in what our technical civilization has accomplished. But these disclosures would be of technical capabilities that are already a generation old. So we wouldn't lose the value of other countries being aware that now, 50 years later, we can do even more powerful. After all, Rich of Lockheed stated shortly before his death that, anything you can imagine that we could achieve, we've already achieved. We now have the technology to take ET home. So another factor, another bright line distinction I'd like to make is that the other world powers know what we have achieved, and in some cases have already achieved it themselves. For example, the former Soviet Union was only 2 years behind us when we developed teleportation. When William Whitecrow and others and myself were on Mars in the early to mid-1980s, we were regularly crossing paths with British and Soviet Russian teams of jumpers. So there's not much that's going to be lost in terms of what you might call the sort of the psycho-guerrilla warfare component of these secrets. The group that's really being kept in the dark is the public itself. I'm not urging the disclosure of time travel to make time travel operational by individuals. I'm urging the disclosure of time travel so that the American people know that we've had Tesla teleportation for almost 50 years, and they and everybody else on planet Earth could have been traveling via Tesla teleportation in 1970. I mean, think about, as William cited, the crisis of global warming. When Al Gore was sitting, as a college sophomore in Roger Revell's climate change, or not back then, they were calling it the greenhouse effect. In Roger Revell's greenhouse seminar, secretly, the U.S. defense technical community had reduced to practice a technology that could limit 60% of the greenhouse gases that are attributable to human industry from entering the world's atmosphere every year. I mean, that's an over 50% solution to what we can control in terms of global warming. So I view this in terms of more of the urgent necessity to bring our civilization forward and eliminate, as Al Gore stated in Earth in the Balance, eliminate the major bane of our time in terms of climate, which is the internal combustion engine, and replace it rather with free energy-based teleportation, in which everybody in the world who would be cleared for a certain jump could get everywhere else in the world they would need to go in seconds rather than in hours. That's going to clean up the atmosphere. It's going to bring the world together so everybody, just like college students discover that somebody literally born on the other side of the planet is their brother or sister. We're going to be able to usher in such a world when we have the time urgency of teleportation-based transit. Okay, so I'm not urging the widespread social involvement of people in time travel. That would be destabilizing. It would be disruptive. But we do need to have the design science revolution to introduce teleportation, or we are going to see new high temperatures followed possibly by either a new ice age if the cold snap occurs in the winter, or massive coastal flooding if it occurs in the summer, as described by Art Bell and Whitley Strieber in their book, The Coming Global Superstorm. That book basically presents the view of climate change that was pioneered by Andrew Marshall, the head for many decades of the Office of Net Assessment. So this isn't a matter of just the goals of the truth community and trying to bring about this change. This is an urgent practical necessity to save our civilization. That is to say, the declassification and deployment of Tesla teleportation in real time to eliminate the greenhouse gases that are being produced by transportation.
I get where you're going with all of this. I understand it. I applaud the idea of it. But we are out of time. But I've one throw question at you here, because if you were up on a debate stand right now, the follow-up on that would be something along these lines. Mr. Basiago, by introducing this teleportation activity and doing all that you're saying, although it would cut down on emissions, cut down on greenhouse effect, and save our planet in the long run, you're shutting down airline, you're shutting down cars, you're shutting down other modes of transportation, or at least severely denting and wounding that industry. And then all of those hundreds of thousands of people that work for those industries and companies will be out of work. What do we do then? Not saying that the greater good of our planet is at stake here, because we got to keep people working, but you got to understand too, as a presidential candidate, keeping people employed and keeping people in an industry that we haven't figured out how to replace, and what would we have them do then?
Dave,
how do we deal with that? Yeah.
Dave, when we launched the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb,
right,
we suddenly employed 84,000 people in the same project. We are certainly capable as a civilization of creating new jobs in the teleportation-based infrastructure that would exist for both human transport and especially for shipping. So we can't – it's never been valid. We found this in the old growth issue in the Northwest. It is not valid to say that I should be able to keep my father or my grandfather's job because to introduce new technology would be disruptive. In fact, we'll create more wealth, more convenience, more jobs by introducing the best available technology. That's what the historical record actually shows. So would there have to be an historical transition to the new infrastructure? Yes. Have we done it in the past? Well, we did it 55 years ago when we put Project Manhattan together. You know, suddenly 84,000 people, or maybe perhaps it was 64,000, but many, many tens of thousands of people were suddenly on a secret project, and there wasn't a single breach of project secrecy. So we've already shown as a civilization that we're capable of launching massive projects that do things highly effectively. So yes, the transition that you cite will have to occur. But at the same time, what we would get is we would control the high road, the high frontier of time-space. One thing that I think was implied by William's answer is we have to prevent another country or faction creating a teleportation infrastructure and freezing us out of it. So we have to do it to prevent military surprise, which was is literally the mission of DARPA. And that means not just developing it back in my father's generation, but now implementing it in my generation. And that's what I've dedicated my life to achieving. So that's what we need to do. And the arguments that we shouldn't do because the technology is disruptive, that's causing us to stagnate in this 1970s reality that we're all inhabiting. And I think we should move forward as a country.
And I agree with you on that moving forward. Yeah. I think the other problem we have is, as you said, so much of what we have in the world is already 10 to 20 years behind the technology of what our government is using. But the fact is, we still have not effectively created a way to be able to keep Russia from hacking voting terminals. And we haven't been able to figure out ways to keep people like Edward Snowden from downloading and sharing secret information. If we, in fact, create this teleportation, how do we know at some point that some rogue country doesn't disrupt and push a button and all those people that are in the middle of transport are now lost in time and space?
Well, that would be an act of war. That we presently control acts of war by, for example, protecting our commercial passenger planes from being blown up or hijacked or whatever. Those are security issues, but they don't go to the fundamental need to evolve the society. And let me also add that implicit in your point is my point, which is that if we don't do this, we will be subjected potentially, probably realistically, likely, to the military surprise of another world power or organized criminal network or terror faction that will achieve that mastery of time-space on a gross social level first. So just as in any area of applied science, we want to control the high frontier, or we're sunk as a country. And that's what I think Project Pegasus achieved. My dad's generation gave us that technology. It's now our responsibility as the most advanced and democratic country on earth to implement that technology in a way in which everybody on the planet potentially has access to that technology, but we control for things like use of the technology to launch military operations of surprise, trespass issues, and so forth. All of those are already controlled for when we land a given commercial passenger plane in a given airport. Look at how we're screening people before they get on a passenger plane. In fact, we'll be a safer world when the overwhelming number of people are commuting via teleportation rather than, for example, commercial passenger planes or automobiles, because in fact they're more controllable than conventional conveyances. So I'm saying that all of these scary formulations that people are trying to use to prevent the time-space age from now fully emerging, they have ready explanations. And in fact, it's in our net interest, it's in our security interest to launch a broadly based societal program of teleportation so that those teleports will be available to us militarily in the event that some country or rogue faction seeks to exploit the technology.
Why not work then? We have a rogue president in charge right now who wants to change the world and wants to be the one responsible for outing all of our dirty, dark secrets. Why not work along with President Trump to help get this information out there, raise your public awareness, and get you in a better position for 2020?
I have every intention to do so. The elections were just back in November. I wasn't contacted by his organization. I'm going to be writing the Trump administration and lobbying the U.S. government to when he mentioned in his first speech before Congress introducing the technologies of the future, I think he had some of that in mind. So I'm certainly going to be approaching the president and urging him to declassify and deploy Tesla teleportation for real-time transport.
Well, I can't thank you enough. Andrew Basiago, always a pleasure, always intriguing and thought-provoking to have you join us. I also want to thank Major General Mark Musick, co-author of Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes, for joining us, and William Whitecrow for being a part of the show with us this evening as well. You can find more information about Andy's run for presidency at Andy2020.net. You can find more about his work on Mars with ProjectMars.net and ProjectPegasus.net for more information there. We also want to thank our sponsors for the show. Especially want to start off with Casper Beds. And remember, to receive $50 towards any mattress purchase, go to CasperTrial.com/darkness. Again, that's CasperTrial.com/darkness, and put in the code promo code 50SLEEP to save that $50 and make your first purchase. And also special thanks to TrueCar, one of our sponsors here as well. When you are in the market for a new or used car, visit TrueCar to enjoy a more confident car buying experience. I'll be hosting Coast to Coast AM on Saturday night from midnight till 4 a.m., the best in overnight talk radio, and I would love for you to join me. So go check out coasttocoastam.com for times and stations in your area, or remember, you can listen to it at KNSIRadio.com. That's KNSIRadio.com. George Norrie has a great show lined up for you tonight. In the first half, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, Michael Breen, first began living in South Korea in 1982. He covered North and South Korea for several newspapers, including The Guardian UK. He'll report on the dramatic changes happening in South Korea, as well as how the leadership of North Korea developed and how that affects the U.S. In the second half of the show, paranormal investigator and feature columnist for Skeptical Inquirer Joe Nickel will discuss his latest work on ghosts and Bigfoot. He's been examining the Bigfoot cases to find out if some sightings are actually nothing more than brown bear sightings. So you can tune in tonight on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. We'll be back tomorrow. Ursula Bialski, our guest, a brand new theater of the mind as we examine the ghost in you, poltergeists, electrokinesis, and phantasms of the living. You can hear that tomorrow with Tim Dennis and Dave Schrader here on the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.